Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware, A-W-A-R-E, are the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, June 27th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for their wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they are nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. AWARE was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here at home comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. An international poll showed that the U.S. is the most feared country in the world today, far more than Russia or China. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. China has 1 foreign military base. Russia may have as many as 15 if you count the bases in the former Soviet Union. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with a remark by a friend of AWARE, Professor Francis Boyle at the University of Illinois Law School. He's reacting to a headline this morning in the Financial Times, quote, Trump warns Syria over suspected chemical attack plan. White House says Assad regime will pay heavy price if it commits mass murder again, close quote. Now, this needs to be unpacked. President Trump sent 59 Tomahawk missiles on a Syrian air base after hearing a report and seeing pictures of casualties from an attack said to be a sarin gas attack in a rebel center in Syria. It was alleged that the attack was carried out by the Assad government, the legitimate government in Damascus. This is probably false, but on the basis of, primarily, he said, of the pictures that he saw in the press, President Trump ordered an attack on Syria that killed a number of personnel and did some damage to this air base used by Syria and its Russian allies. Francis Boyle, professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law, was interviewed at the website Consortium, and I'll post that interview on the Facebook page for Aware. He said yesterday, the current posture of U.S., French, and perhaps British policy in Syria is basically an invitation for some jihadist group to stage a chemical weapons attack in Syria. That would get blamed on President Assad, and the U.S. would bomb him. This is an intolerable, incredibly dangerous situation brought on by constant illegal U.S. meddling. Close quote. This is true, and the matter is very serious indeed. One of the few American politicians who actually has described accurately what the last administration and this one is doing in Syria, former presidential candidate Ron Paul, discussed an article that appeared not in an English language publication, which wouldn't run it, but in a German publication this weekend about that former gas attack that led to the American Tomahawk missiles being sent into Syria. The story that Hirsch tells is very different from what the American government has said. And Seymour Hersh is a serious voice who for many years has been exposing the lies of American administrations all the way back to the lies about the Pinkville massacre, as it was called in Vietnam, and the torture at Abu Ghraib by the Bush administration. He also exposed the lies of the Obama administration about the killing of Osama bin Laden and other aspects of the policy, the duplicitous policy carried on by the last administration in the Middle East. Now he's doing the same thing in regard to the policy of the Trump administration. Former Congressman Ron Paul discusses the new Seymour Hersh article out this week, showing that the U.S. knew that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was not responsible for the chemical attack in April, but President Trump decided to bomb anyway. Ron Paul singles out Representative Adam Kinzinger, a young Illinois Democratic congressman, for being a hawk who is, quote, determined to stir up super antagonism towards Russia, and criticizes Trump for allowing himself to be influenced. I left out a close quote there. It is our representative in Washington, Adam Kinzinger, that's not Kissinger, that's Kinzinger, who is the object of Ron Paul's ire here, and also Trump himself for allowing himself to be influenced into killing people in Syria with Tomahawk missiles. Ron Paul says someone did a special interview this week, and he's getting to be well known, someone who's not yet 40 years old. Representative Adam Kinzinger from Illinois. He's determined to stir up super antagonism towards Russia, and he cannot stand the fact that there might be a softer approach, and he doesn't like Trump. We're not Trump champions, says Ron Paul, but Kinzinger opposes Trump for this reason. He's not hawkish enough. He did point out that Trump's positions on foreign policy are actually not that bad when he sends 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria. Read some irony here. Kinzinger likes that. Of course, there is this issue of gas, whether it was actually gas, sarin gas, released in April, and we've had people looking into this. And this is ongoing, but there may be signs that the monolith against Russia and Assad, symbolized by a 97-2 vote in the Senate, could be starting to crack. He doesn't really like Putin because, quote, he's killing his own people. This is what we get from people like Kinzinger in the Congress. Well, I don't know exactly what he's referring to. I know Putin is no angel, says Ron Paul, but when you think of how many people our foreign policy kills, we talk about that so often, this is just such hypocrisy, but is mainly to promote a hawkish policy back to Assad has to go. We're going to exercise regime change in Syria. Ron Paul continues, to me, it's amazing how the liberal Democrats, who are supposed to be anti-war like they were in the 60s, they are now, it looks like, maybe more hawkish than the Republicans. It's amazing. Seymour Hersh had an article over the weekend, and everyone is talking about it today. It's a blockbuster article. It absolutely damages Trump completely, but it also damages the pro-war narrative. Nobody in the Washington Post or the New York Times. Here's a blockbuster from a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, and he had to go to Germany to get it published. Nobody in the U.S. will touch it. The article essentially says, based on his intelligence contacts, that the U.S. knew, President Trump knew, this was not a chemical attack in April, and he fired the Tomahawks anyway, and the article is a blockbuster. Think about it. Nobody wants to touch it in the American media, an article like that. Isn't it strange how Trump is so back and forth on foreign affairs? I think that's the worst position to be, but Trump is criticized mostly by the Kinzingers and the others in the Senate for being too soft on Russia. But then he comes and he's too aggressive from our viewpoint. He's dropping bombs willy-nilly, and it scares us that he will do that. He will be influenced by that. And now what we're seeing is it wasn't ignorance. There was material out there that informed President Trump exactly what had happened in Syria, or more importantly, what hadn't happened, the sarin gas attack. Ron Paul continues, it sort of reminds me of what was available to us that we could find before the Iraq War. It was there by reputable people, but it was lost in politics. It's a shame. Here's an excerpt from Hersh's latest article. Within hours of viewing the photos, that's the photos of the casualties of this supposed gas attack in Syria, Trump instructed the national defense apparatus to plan for retaliation against Syria. This is in April. He did this before he talked to anybody about it. The planners then asked the CIA and the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Administration, if there was any evidence that Syria had sarin stored at a nearby airport or somebody in the area. The military had to have it somewhere in the area in order to bomb with it. The answer was, we have no evidence that Syria had sarin or used it. The CIA also told them there was no residual delivery for sarin at Shayrat, that's the airfield from which the Syrian bombers had taken off on April 4th, and Assad had no motive to commit political suicide. Everyone involved, except perhaps the president, also understood that a highly skilled United Nations team had spent more than a year in the aftermath of an alleged sarin attack in 2013 by Syria, removing what was said to be all chemical weapons from a dozen Syrian chemical weapons depots. At this point, the advisor said, the president's national security planners were more than a little rattled. No one knew the provenance of the photographs. There's photographs of corpses, dead children, supposedly killed by the supposed sarin gas attack in Syria. We didn't know who the children were or how they got hurt. Sarin actually is very easy to detect because it penetrates paint. and all one would have to do is get a paint sample. We knew there was a cloud, and we knew it hurt people. But that's at the air base in April that was subsequently attacked by the U.S. But you cannot jump from there to certainty that Assad had hidden sarin from the UN because he wanted to use it at Khan Sheikhoun. That's the place where the sarin gas attack was supposed to have taken place. The intelligence made clear that a Syrian Air Force Su-24 fighter bomber had used a conventional weapon to hit a target. There had been no chemical warhead, and yet it was impossible for the experts to persuade the president of this once he'd made up his mind. The president saw the photographs of poisoned little girls and said it was an Assad atrocity. It's typical of human nature. You jump to the conclusion you want. Intelligence analysts do not argue with the president. They're not going to tell the president, if you interpret the data that way, I quit. No, they kept their job. He was told we did not have evidence of Syrian involvement, and yet Trump said, do it, that is, attack Syria with the Tomahawks. On April 6, Trump convened a meeting of national security officials at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. The meeting was not to decide what to do, but how best to do it, or as some wanted, how to do the least and keep Trump happy. Quote, the boss knew before the meeting that they didn't have the intelligence, but that was not the issue, an advisor said. The meeting was about, here's what I'm going to do, and then he gets the options. Close quote. The available intelligence was not relevant. The most experienced man at the table was Secretary of Defense James Mattis, a retired Marine Corps general who had the president's respect and understood perhaps how quickly that could evaporate. Mike Pompeo, the CIA director whose agency had consistently reported that it had no evidence of a Syrian chemical bomb, was not present. Secretary of State Tillerson was admired on the inside for his willingness to work long hours and his avid reading of diplomatic cables and reports, but he knew little about waging war and the management of a bombing raid. Those present were in a bind, the advisor said. The president was emotionally energized by the disaster, and he wanted options. He got 4 of them in order of extremity. Option 1 was to do nothing in response to this supposed Syrian gas attack. Option 1 was to do nothing. All involved, the advisor said, understood that that was a non-starter. Option 2 was a slap on the wrist, to bomb an airfield in Syria, but only after alerting the Russians, and through them the Syrians, to avoid too many casualties. A few of the planners called this the guerrilla option. America would glower and beat its chest to provoke fear and demonstrate resolve, but cause little significant damage. The third option was to adopt the strike package that had been presented to Obama in 2013, and which he ultimately chose not to pursue, because of the diplomatic actions of the Russians, by the way. That plan called for the massive bombing of the main Syrian airfields and command and control centers using B-1 and B-52 aircraft launched from their bases in the U.S. Option 4 was decapitation, to remove Assad by bombing his palace in Damascus, as well as his command and control network and all of the underground bunkers he could possibly retreat to in a crisis. Trump ruled out option 1 off the bat, the senior advisor said, and the assassination of Assad was never considered. But he said, in essence, you're the military and I want military action. The president was also initially opposed to the idea of giving the Russians advance warning before the strike, but reluctantly accepted it. We gave, quote, we gave him the Goldilocks option, not too hot, not too cold, but just right, close quote. The discussion had its bizarre moments. Tillerson, the Secretary of State, wondered at the Mar-a-Lago meeting why the president could not simply call in the B-52 bombers and pulverize the airbase. He was told that B-52s were very vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, in the area, and using such planes would require suppression fire that could kill some Russian defenders. What is that? Tillerson asked. Well, sir, he was told, that means we would have to destroy the upgraded SAM sites along the B-52 flight path, and those are manned by Russians, and we possibly would be confronted with a much more difficult situation. Quote, the lesson here was, thank God for the military men at the meeting, the advisor said. They did the best they could when confronted with a decision that had already been made, close quote. That is, Trump's decision that some sort of attack was necessary. The discussions of this within the Trump administration are in marked contrast to the criticism of the war-making of the Obama administration that Trump offered during the campaign. This last piece that I have been quoting from is from Congressman Ron Paul quoting Seymour Hersh's article about the attack that President Trump ordered on Syria in response to this apparently mythical gas attack. One of the best accounts that's appeared in the American media, and one of the more shocking aspects of the whole matter, is that so little has appeared in the American media. Even Seymour Hersh's article had to be published in a German magazine, not in any American outlet, which refused to run it. A real account of what the United States is doing in Syria depends upon the foreign press, not the American press, which on matters like this is effectively heavily censored. A good account of the whole affair comes from Ray McGovern, an ex-CIA man who was in fact the briefer for George Bush, President George Bush, on his daily intelligence report. He would bring the report to Bush each morning, and was so appalled at the attack on Iraq that he left the CIA and formed a group called Intelligence Agents for Reform, for which he speaks these days. This is Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern writes about the reportage of the event of Trump's attack on the Syrian air base as follows. Legendary investigative reporter Seymour Hersh is challenging the Trump administration's version of events surrounding the April 4th chemical weapons attack, in quotes, because there's good evidence the attack never occurred, on the northern Syrian town of Khan Sheikhoun, though Hersh had to find a publisher in Germany to get his information out. In last Sunday's edition of Die Welt, Hersh reports that his national security sources offered a distinctly different account, revealing President Trump rashly deciding to launch 59 Tomahawk missiles against a Syrian air base on April 6, despite the absence of intelligence supporting his conclusion that the Syrian military was guilty. Hersh draws on the kind of inside sources from whom he has earned long-standing trust to dispute that there ever was a chemical weapons attack, and to assert that Trump was told that no evidence existed against the Syrian government, but ordered, quote, his generals, close quote, to retaliate anyway. Marine General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and former Marine General Defense Secretary James Mad Dog Mattis ordered the attacks apparently knowing that the reason given was what one of Hersh's sources called a fairy tale. They then left it to Trump's national security advisor, Army General H.R. McMaster, to further the deceit with the help of a compliant mainstream media, which broke from its current tradition of distrusting whatever Trump says in favor of its older tradition of favoring regime change in Syria and trusting pretty much whatever the rebels, the jihadists that the U.S. is supporting in Syria, whatever the rebels claim. According to Hersh's sources, the normal deconfliction process was followed before the April 4th strike. In such procedures, U.S. and Russian officers supply one another with advanced details of airstrikes, such as target coordinates, to avoid accidental confrontations among the warplanes crisscrossing Syria. Russian and Syrian Air Force officers gave details of the flight path to and from Khan Sheikhoun in English, Hirsch reported. The target was a two-story cinder block building in which senior leaders, high-value targets, as they say in Washington, of the two jihadist groups controlling the town were about to hold a meeting. Because of the perceived importance of the mission, the Russians took the unusual step of giving the Syrian Air Force a GPS-guided bomb to do the job. But the explosives were conventional, not chemical, Hirsch reported. Now, this is what's happening when the U.S. is being informed of an attack on the jihadist forces that are opposing the Syrian government. Russia is legally in Syria, supporting the Syrian government against these rebels, these jihadists, these terrorists that are supported by the United States, which of course is not legally in Syria. It's not there as a result of any international direction or invitation from the Syrian government. What was planned here was an attack on the rebels against the Syrian government, and in order to make clear that this was part of the support the Russians were giving the legitimate government of Syria, the Russians informed the Americans that such an attack would take place, and it would take place with conventional bombs. The meeting place that was being attacked was on the floor above the basement of the building, where a source whom Hirsch described as a senior advisor to the U.S. intelligence community told Hirsch the basement was used as a storage for rockets, weapons, and ammunition, and also chlorine-based decontaminants for cleansing the bodies of the dead before burial. Close quote. Hirsch described what happened when the building was struck on the morning of April 4th. A bomb damage assessment by the U.S. military later determined the heat and force of the 500-pound Syrian bomb triggered a series of secondary explosions that could have generated a huge toxic cloud that began to spread over the town, formed by the release of fertilizers, disinfectants, and other goods stored in the basement, its effect magnified by the dense morning air, which trapped the fumes close to the ground. According to intelligence estimates, the strike itself killed up to 4 jihadist leaders and an unknown numbers of drivers and security aides. There is no confirmed count of the number of civilians killed by the poisonous gases that were released by the secondary explosions, although opposition activists reported that there were more than 80 dead, and outlets such as CNN have put the figure as high as 92, close quote. Due to the fog of war, which is made denser by the fact that jihadists associated with al-Qaeda control the area, many of the details of the incident were unclear on that day and remain so still. No independent on-the-ground investigation has taken place. But there were other reasons to doubt Syrian guilt, including the implausibility of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad choosing that time, while his forces were making dramatic strides in finally defeating the jihadists, and immediately after the Trump administration had indicated it had reversed President Obama's regime change policy in Syria, to launch a sarin attack, which was sure to outrage the world and likely draw U.S. retaliation. The Assad government had no motive for doing that. However, logic was brushed aside after local activists, including some closely tied to the jihadists, quickly uploaded all manner of images onto social media showing dead and dying children and other victims said to be suffering from sarin nerve gas. Inconsistencies were brushed aside, such as the eyewitness who insisted we could smell it from 500 meters away. Sarin is odorless. Still, whether credible or not, these social media images had a potent propaganda effect. Hirsch writes within the hours of watching the gruesome photos on TV, and before he'd received any U.S. intelligence corroboration, Trump told his national security aides to plan retaliation against Syria. According to Hirsch, it was an evidence-free decision, except for what Trump had seen on TV. Hirsch quotes one U.S. officer who, upon learning of the White House decision to retaliate against Syria, remarked, quote, We know that there was no chemical attack. The Russians are furious, claiming we have the real intel and know the truth, close quote. A similar event had occurred on August 21st, 2013, outside Damascus, and although the available evidence now points to a false flag provocation pulled off by the jihadists to trick the West into mounting a full-fledged assault on Assad's military, Western media still blames that incident on Assad too. In the August 21st, 2013 case, social media also proved crucial in creating and pushing the Assad did it narrative. On August 30th, 2013, then Secretary of State John Kerry pinned the responsibility on Assad no fewer than 35 times, even though earlier that week National Intelligence Director James Clapper had warned President Obama privately that Assad's culpability was, quote, not a slam dunk, close quote. Kerry was fond of describing social media as an extraordinary useful tool, and it sure did come in handy in supporting Kerry's repeated but unproven charges against Assad, especially since the U.S. government had invested heavily in training and equipping Syrian activists to dramatize their cause. The mainstream media also has ignored evidence that the jihadists staged at least one chlorine gas attack, and as you may recall, President George W. Bush also spoke glowingly about the value of, quote, catapulting the propaganda, close quote. To the extent that Seymour Hersh's account finds its way into Western corporate media, most likely it will be dismissed out of hand simply because it dovetails with Moscow's version of what happened and thus is, ipso facto, wrong. But the Russians and the Syrians know what did happen. And if there really was no sarin bombing, they recognized Trump's reckless resort to tomahawks and the subsequent attempts to cover up for the president. All this will have repercussions. This is as tense a time in U.S.-Russian relations as I can remember from my 5 decades of experience watching Russian and defense and foreign policy, writes Ray McGovern. It's left to the Russians to figure out which is worse, a president controlled by his generals or one who is so out of control that his generals are the ones who must restrain him. With Russia reiterating its threat to target any unannounced aircraft flying in Syrian airspace west of the Euphrates, Russian President Putin could authorize his own generals to shoot first and ask questions later. Then hold on to your hat. As of this writing, there is no sign in mainstream media of any reporting on Hersh's groundbreaking piece. It is a commentary on the conformist nature of today's Western media that an alternative analysis challenging the conventional wisdom, even when produced by a prominent journalist like Cy Hersh, faces such trouble finding a place to publish. The mainstream hatred of Assad and Putin has reached such extraordinary levels that pretty much anything can be said or written about them, with few, if any, politicians or journalists daring to express doubts regardless of how shaky the evidence is. Even the London Review of Books, which published Hersh's earlier debunking of the August 25th, 2013 sarin gas attack, wouldn't go out onto the limb this time, despite having paid for the investigation. According to Hersh, the LRB, the London Review of Books, did not want to be, quote, vulnerable to criticism for seeming to take the view of the Syrian and Russian governments when it came to the April 4th bombing in Khan Sheikhoun, close quote. So much for diversity of thought in today's West. Yet what was interesting about the Khan Sheikhoun case is that was a test of whom the mainstream media detested more. The mainstream media has taken the position that pretty much whatever Trump says is untrue, or at least deserving of intense fact-checking. But the mainstream media also believes whatever attacks on Assad and the Syrian activists post on social media are true, and disbelieves whatever Putin says. So this was a tug of war on which prejudices were stronger. It turned out that the antipathy towards Syria and Russia is much more powerful than the distrust of Trump. The mainstream media bought into Trump's narrative to such a degree that any criticism, no matter how credentialed the critic, gets either ignored or ridiculed. For instance, Ray McGovern writes, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity produced a memo on April 11th questioning Trump's rush to judgment. Former MIT professor Ted Postel, a specialist in applying science to national security incidents, also poked major holes in the narrative of a government sarin attack. But the mainstream media silence was deafening. In his remarks to Die Welt, which eventually published his account, Seymour Hersh, who first became famous for exposing the My Lai massacre story during the Vietnam War and disclosed the Abu Ghraib abuse story during the Iraq War, explained that he still gets upset at government lying at the reluctance of the media to hold governments accountable. Quote, Seymour Hersh, "We have a president in America today who lies repeatedly, but he must learn that he can not lie about intelligence relied upon before authorizing an active war. There are those in the Trump administration who understand this, which is why I learned the information I did. If this story creates even a few moments of regret in the White House, it will have served a very high purpose." Close quote. But it may be that the Germans reading Welt am Sonntag, the published Hersh's account, may be among the few who will get the benefit of Hersh's contrarian view of the April 4th incident in Khan Sheikhoun. Perhaps they will begin to wonder why Chancellor Angela Merkel continues with her Me Too approach to whatever Washington wants to do regarding tensions with Russia and warfare in Syria. Will Merkel admit that she was likely deceived in parroting Washington's line, making the Syrian government responsible for a massacre with chemical weapons on April 4th? Mercifully, most Americans would be spared having to choose between believing President Trump and Seymour Hersh, because Seymour Hersh's account is not published in places except like this one. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 26th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Penno. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for the articles referred to tonight, notably Seymour Hersh's account and Ron Paul's discussion of it. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. The last part of this program will be devoted to some truth-telling by one of the few recent presidential candidates actually to oppose American war-making around the world, that is former Congressman Ron Paul. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul.
Oh, very good. And I guess we have a couple subjects to talk about today, but dealing with foreign policy. And, you know, we've touched on a couple occasions already about the war on sanctions. And, you know, the Senate passes it 97-2, you know, and it looks like it's going to sail through. But all of a sudden, you know, and we brought the subject up, it still has to go to the House, and there's some resistance there. It's not probably exactly coming from all our kind of people, but it's for various reasons, but it isn't sailing through, and there's a bit of a fight going on. And somebody got a special interview this week, and he's getting to be well known. He's not 40 years old yet, but he's been fighting in a couple wars, and he sort of reminds me of a Tom Cotton type member of Congress. And he was in Congress for 2 years before I left, and that's Kinzinger from Illinois, Adam Kinzinger. And he is determined to stir up, a super antagonism toward Russia, and he cannot stand the fact that there might be a softer approach, and he doesn't like Trump. We're not Trump champions, no. but it's for the reason that Trump is not hawkish enough. And even though, but he did point out that Trump's positions, what he does is not all that bad. When he sends 59 Tomahawks into Syria and certain things like that, he likes that. Of course, then there's this issue of gas, whether there was actually gas released recently in April there, and we've had some people look into this. But this is ongoing, but there may be signs that the monolith against Russia and Assad, as symbolized by a 97-2 vote, maybe that's starting to crack.
Yeah, and Kinzinger, this is a Politico profile. Of course, they always do fawning profiles of the real super hawkish guys. But he said, quote, he's going to raise holy hell if the House doesn't pass these Russia sanctions. He's furious about it. He's angry with Trump. This is astonishing. He's a Republican. This is what he said essentially about his own president. I'm no fan of Obama, but I'd rather have him as president than Putin. So was he saying that his own president from his own party is somehow Putin?
Yeah, but you know why he really doesn't like Putin? He's killing his own people. Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what he's referring to. I know Putin is no angel, yeah. And yet when you think of how many people that our foreign policy has killed, we've talked about that so often. With all the collateral damage and the kind of killing that goes on. Not 10 or 15, just in the last week or two, there were 400 or 500 more civilians killed. So this is just such hypocrisy, but it's mainly to promote a policy, a hawkish policy, and it's back to, Assad has to go, that policy. And to me, it's amazing how, the liberal Democrats, who are supposed to be anti-war like they were in the 1960s, they're now, it looks like, maybe more hawkish than Republicans. And they're sort of, the Republicans for partisan reasons, but also they're not chomping on the bit at Trump for maybe having a softer stand with Russia, but the leadership in the neocon movement and in the deep state, that's a different story.
Yeah, but I think things are starting to shift slightly on the Democrat side. The Hill ran a story a couple of days ago about how rank-and-file Democrats are in the House especially, are getting very frustrated with this Russia obsession. They quoted Tim Walz, a liberal Democrat from Minnesota. He said, I did a 22-county tour of my district, and nobody is focused on the Russia stuff. They just got stung badly in Atlanta, where they lost this election. They were supposed to win because they were focused on it. And I think there's a slight rebellion going on within the ranks against Pelosi and Schumer, who continue to push this. Pelosi said, what do the Russians have on Donald Trump earlier this month? So I think there is a slight shift because it's hurting them at the ballot box.
Yeah, and I think that means that the system may have a little bit of life left to it, and things can be changed. And I think there are some people who are having an influence, on this. Seymour Hersh has some influence, and also Oliver Stone.
Yeah.
He's had some influence. He's talked about it, which is more objectivity than promoting a very biased position. But of course, that's not what they get credit for. They don't come along and say, to a Hersh, well, you're the most unbiased reporter, investigative reporter ever, so therefore we'd like to have your material. What do? Because he takes an unbiased position, he is so biased against the nonsense, the propaganda of both parties. So he becomes the enemy, and I understand he's done some work recently. He had trouble even getting it published, even though there were some people that had spent some money to help him do the investigation.
It's amazing, he had an article over the weekend. Everyone's talking about it today. And essentially, you would expect, it's a blockbuster article. It absolutely damages Trump completely, but it also damages the pro-war narrative. He had to go to Germany to get it published. Nobody in the Washington Post, New York Times, here's a blockbuster from a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, investigative reporter. Nobody in the U.S. will touch it. And the article essentially says that, based on his intelligence contacts, that the U.S. knew, the Trump administration knew that this was not a chemical attack in April, and he fired the Tomahawks anyway. And it's a blockbuster. Think about it. Nobody wants to touch an article like that.
But isn't it strange that Trump, he's back and forth. And I think it's the worst position to have, because you never gain acceptance on one side and you lose it on the other side. But Trump is supposed to be, he's criticized mostly, by the Kinsingers and the others and the Senate. He's too soft on Russia, soft on Russia. But then he comes and he's too aggressive from our viewpoint. He's dropping bombs willy-nilly, and it sort of scares us to figure that if he'll do that, and he's influenced by that, and now what we're seeing is it wasn't out of ignorance. I mean, it was material. There was material out there. It was information. Sort of reminds me of what was available to us that we could find before the Iraq War.
Exactly.
It was there by reputable people, but it's all politics. So it is a shame, and that's also the reason that it's difficult for the politicians know what to do, because some of them, well, we got to support him because he's our Republican leader and da-da-da. And other ones say, well, there's a limit to how far we can go, and they go back and forth. And if you had a principled president you didn't agree with, and he stuck to it, it wouldn't be so confusing. But if you have an unprincipled president, then on one day he looks like he wants to be the best friends with Russia, and the next day he said, we got to destroy them in Syria, and oppose everything they're doing there.
There's a danger here, and it's on multiple fronts. So from what Hearst reported, Trump did not get credible intelligence reports about the chemical attacks. He simply got his information from the news media. And the mainstream media ran with the narrative. Assad did it because they were programmed to do it. They never questioned it, and it wasn't based on any sources. And there's a difficulty, of an average CIA officer saying, Mr. President, you're totally wrong. That's a difficulty. But what does it say about our mainstream media that we are not being informed of actual facts? We're being propagandized. We take such pride in our free media, but it almost feels like we're in the Soviet Union in 1955.
Isn't it interesting, amazing that you can use the same lie twice? In 13 they did it too, and it was spilled out there by the media. They all supported it, and I imagine that if you can find some Americans who are really paying attention, probably most of them are going to say, oh, yeah, the Russians use poison gas, and Assad used gas.
Yeah.
How often has it been, we got to get rid of Assad because Assad gassed his own people.
Yeah, it's a slogan,
Yeah, and it's totally a lie. And when you find out that our military will use this for doing something militarily, and then say, well, the generals have more leeway, and before you know it, they drop big bombs and they drop little bombs and they plan to drop more, and they stay involved like this. It's pretty darn dangerous. They're false flags, and there's a lot of lying going on, and there's a lot of propaganda, just as Kinzinger is going here. He's out there out front and pushing it very hard, right in the political system, and he gets the attention, and Hearst doesn't get any. McCain, he's on TV all the time. They who promote this issue, and it satisfies the media, they get all the attention.
They get on TV, yep.
But if you tell the truth, what happens to Ed Snowden for telling the truth?
Yeah.
So it's a tough job. But you put in some statistic that maybe it's not working, which is very interesting that the Democrats may not be winning on this issue. They didn't win in Georgia, so that's pretty good.
The rank and file are getting frustrated. There was another article in The Hill, strangely enough, but it was a Harvard-Harris poll from June 19th to 21st, so very recent poll. A couple of numbers are going to be surprising to you, I think. But I think the Dems should be looking at this, and I think they are. 64% of voters said the investigations into Trump are hurting the country. 73% say they're concerned that the Russian probes have caused Congress to lose focus. That includes 68% of Democrats. And 62% of all voters surveyed said there's no hard evidence to support the collusion with Russia thing. So this is falling dead among the electorate, and I think the Democrats are getting frustrated with their leadership.
The old saying was, whether people vote from their hearts or from their head. And I always argued that they vote from their bellies.
Yeah.
And it was said by others that it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's almost always the economy. Other issues, come in, but maybe this stuff is a little too esoteric from them. I have trouble keeping up with all of the investigations. What are they doing? How are they going to stop? And who has the authority to do it? And why do we have this many authority that are in a position where they're inside the in the government, and they're probably working on a coup of the president. So it just goes on. It's amazing that they can continue to do this.
But Congress won't take a few minutes to debate whether or not we should be attacking Assad's forces in Syria when they're fighting ISIS. No, there's no time for that. More probes, more curlicues.
Yeah, well, I think this is going to be around here for a bit. I think that we may be seeing a political shift where the people who are unemployed or underemployed or maybe real people that they don't ever count or pay attention to, and maybe there's still that concern out there, and this gets too esoteric because it's hard to understand, and there's so many stories told back and forth that they're not getting that interested. So maybe there will be a shift, and we'll see, because the bellwether on this might be who is the Democratic leader in the House in about 6 months from now.
Yeah.
Are they going to do something soon, or are they going to wait until the next election? Are they going to, see what happens? But it's pretty amazing that she survives it all. So what do you think is going to happen here? How would you summarize this?
Well, I would like to think that the Hirsch article will get a wider reading. It's very embarrassing and it's very sad, and it should be a disgrace that he had to go to a foreign press to get this published. But there is a side article that's a conversation between a military operative on the field, on the ground, loading the Tomahawks, and an intel advisor. I encourage people to read that exchange. It's full of very strong words because the guy is literally terrified that we know we're launching these and we know it's a lie. It's very powerful stuff.
Yeah, it does get confusing. I have to work at trying to keep up with all these things going on and who's telling the truth. That's rare. who's promoting the lies and why. But I think that right now it makes our job easy, which is our job is to present the case for non-interventionism and a pro-American defense policy where we just mind our own business. And this is much easier, to figure out what to do. And the solution from our viewpoint in the Middle East, Syria, why don't we just give it to Russia? They're already there. They have a base there. It's sort of like if somebody was trying to take Guantanamo from us and they were not doing well, why don't we just let the Americans have Guantanamo? Something, like that. But we don't. We just go on and continue to do this. But the principal argument of non-intervention is mind our own business, save some money, protect our liberties here at home. Believe me, there's a lot of merit to this, and that's what our goal should be. And when we see the cracks in the dike there where our views are coming through, I think we like to point them out, but we still have a big job ahead of us because there are a lot of hot spots in the world, and I think that one of these days, one of those may get out of hand, but we'll do our best to keep you up to date on these. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.